Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to another conversation. I hope you will find interesting. We have today Rabbi Daniel Rowe. We had a few conversations, private conversations, and I suggested to him recently we have to have these conversations in public because, as you know, as someone who converted to Judaism, I find this very interesting, and I find the future of Judaism and the history of Judaism definitely very interesting. So I want to let Rabbi Rowe introduce himself. So please go ahead, give us a short introduction, who you are, where you live, what you do.
Sure. First of all, it's so nice to be with you on the show. And yeah, my name's Daniel Rowe, Rabbi. I grew up I grew up as a child in Manchester, England. I lived in London for many years. I've worked primarily as a rabbi, as a Jewish educator, especially although we had a community really outside the community on campuses and in young professional areas for young Jews in particular, who are often less connected or exploring their Judaism. An organization called Aish, which is like the flame of Judaism. It comes from various Talmudic and biblical stories. And now I'm at the world center of that organization in Jerusalem. I moved here just over 18 months ago. I'm primarily, again, still involved in global Jewish education, both here in Israel, but especially groups that come through. And there's lots of different groups come through, and also globally and online. I also separately have an academic career in the world of philosophy, especially philosophy of mathematics, but that's a side issue. And finally, interestingly enough, just because of where we're positioned, we end up with lots of different interfaith groups that come through as well. So I'm often doing educational programs or programs with leaders of other faith communities and so on, and dialogue there as well.
Wonderful. Sounds great. Thank you. I usually like to have, a short of or brief, back and forth to keep everyone engaged. And I think
Amazing.
this is going to be the format of our conversation. So I just want to start by asking you a very simple question. What is Jewishness? What does it mean to be Jewish? Because we discussed this. We discussed, how basically you would get many different answers depending on who you ask. So if you ask a Reform rabbi in America, who is, we now have a lot of, I would probably argue a tiny minority of far left, sort of movement where it's a lot about being a trans rabbi or all this kind of stuff. So everyone is saying, this is Judaism. Judaism is very welcoming of a trans rabbi. That's some people say that. Obviously, I believe this is a minority. This is a far left view. And then we also have other views where people say it has to be explicitly related to halakha and what halakha is, and it has to be, very strict, no compromises on halakha. And then we have some, sort of movements or views that are somewhat in between. So you give me your answer. What does it mean to be Jewish?
Okay, so first of all, the one big problem we have when we use that, even the question in the English language, is typically we think of religions. Right? Religions are defined by a certain faith system or related systems. So you got the Islamic world and the Christian world, but within them you got denominations. Judaism is not actually a Jewish word, but but it goes back to a different model, and it's a model of a nation, a national covenant with God. So that's just a small point, because that then splits us, as I'll come to in a second. But so as Jews, we believe that you can be part of the Jewish faith without keeping the Jewish religion, right? The Jewish religion is a covenantal religion between the nation of Israel and God. And the faith can apply much broader. We have a principle of just fundamental ethical monotheism, that anyone who fits into that, we call it the Noahide covenant, is part of the same faith. But our covenant is a nation with God. So what that then means is that you could define Jews ethnically, right? Somebody who's born to a Jewish family is Jewish, just like a citizen of any other country. If you're born in, you're a member. You could be ethnically British, you're born to a British family. You can define it by its covenant. That's the Jewish religion, which you can actually convert into, right? And you can define it by its kind of national identities. They're really all very different ways of looking at it. Then within the religious side of it, this national covenant, there are those who believe the covenant really is what it claims to be. The Torah is the word of God, and therefore it's binding. It's a higher authority than mankind. And others who believe it's the word of man, but it's part of our national identity. And that gives rise to things like a non-Orthodox movements that typically reform movement, for example, that will typically start from the premise this is not a divine thing, so it's not higher ethical value than the human, it's our traditions, and it can be shaped and will be shaped by the times. You mentioned, like, the far left, let's say in America. I think a young Jew in America who's not born in Orthodox or very traditional home, their religion is actually left-wing politics. It's not typically the Jewish religion. So,
Oh, that's very interesting.
what I mean by that is, like, today, politics, often political tribalism, is often a replacement
Yes.
for religion. The average young person in America born to a Jewish family, or in large parts of the Western world too, uh, their deep ideology is typically the far left, actually, politically. That's the tribe, that's the belonging. And the Jewish heritage will have some customs, some things, a mazel tov, you have a bar mitzvah,
Yes.
things like that. So there'll be, but it's not it's a residual. And that impacts, part of some of those religious movements too.
That's very interesting, actually. So, are you essentially saying that someone who is, part of this far left tribe in America is not really Jewish or less
One,
Jewish
sorry, I
than
should be,
others?
as far as do they belong to the nation, everyone born, it's like, is somebody less British because they reject British law, monarchy, constitution? They're born into, they're British. So somebody born
Yes.
into the Jewish people is as Jewish as everybody else. But if you're asking, when we talk about the religion and covenant, are all the versions the same from an Orthodox perspective means, what do the traditional halachic works say? What does the divine text say? And there, the answer is no. They're not seeing that as the strongest authority. Now, I'm not saying there aren't very passionately religious people in those communities. I'm not, but I'm just saying my second one was much more so. There's an ideological, philosophical. What does Reform Judaism believe in? And Reconstructionist and Conservative and Orthodox and different Orthodox groups. And then there's a practical. The average American Jew and lots of European Jews and even some Israeli Jews are brought up with almost zero connection to Torah, to their heritage, to any form of religion. And if it's any form at all, it's a very soft, loose connection. So, of course, they're Jewish, but they're not trying to lead a life that is defined by Judaism.
Okay, that's very interesting because I think it gets very complicated, and I think this is one of my main questions. Why is it so complicated? So because it's that complicated, we actually have serious issues. So now in the UK, we have a lot of people who say if you define yourself as ethnically Jewish, you're someone who says, okay, I was born to Jewish parents, and my parents were born to Jewish parents, so I can trace my family as a Jew, and we've always been Jewish basically, and that makes me ethnically Jewish. So if you say this, you will have a lot of people who are on the far right now in Britain who will actually say, well, that makes you not British, you're not English, you're not Scottish, you're not Welsh. So what do you say to this? Because we actually see this in for example, Restore Britain now. You get a lot of that stuff. People saying, if you're Jewish, if you're ethnically Jewish, you cannot be ethnically British.
So that, I think there's two things there. First of all, that's a claim that anybody who's got other ethnic roots can't be part of a nation, can't be. British nation is defined by a political area, by an acceptance of British laws, and the moral glue is a loyalty to fellow British people for being British. I remember there was a British politician called Norman Tebbit who once had a go, do they pass the cricket test? And he's still, I don't know, he was in Parliament. He was actually a member of the cabinet at one point. And he was saying, like, you've got Pakistani British who cheer for the Pakistani team, right? And I remember they cheer for the Pakistani cricket team and not for the British cricket team. And he came under a lot of fire for that. And I remember as a little kid in school, we'd heard about that. So we would argue, and we said, at the time, I think England was playing Israel, and we were all supporting England. And we're like, oh, good, we're good British people, But I think the idea that you can only have one loyalty is absurd, right? Can somebody be a loyal Scotsman and still be loyal British? Can somebody feel very English and feel very British and feel European and feel Western and be Christian? Right? Of course. Can they have loyalty to their city as well as to the country? Yes. Can they support one football team against others? Yes. Right? When push comes to shove and you need the national commitment for something, they'll be a part of it, whether it's paying taxes, voting in an election, wanting to see the good of the country. If the country had to be at war, they would go and serve in the army. all of those things are part of the loyalty of a very loyal citizen, and you can absolutely be that and be of all sorts of religious identities and even have identities with others. You can absolutely come from a French and British family and love both countries, but if you're a British citizen, you will follow the responsibilities of citizenship, and you can do that with 100%
Oh,
commitment.
sorry for the interruption, but the problem is, I think we now live in times of yes or no. You're either this or you're this, and that's a challenge we have.
Yeah.
It's very challenging because I get a lot of questions. People asking me, "Well, you were born in Egypt. You grew up in Egypt." I don't really hold almost any values that most Egyptians hold today because it's in complete contrast to who I am. I love ancient Egypt. I love the history. I love visiting the pyramids because I love archaeology. I love all that stuff. But I don't really hold any values, whether it's religion, whether it's the actual political values, beliefs. It's just in complete contrast to everything I stand for today. But still, a lot of people would say, yes, but you were born in Egypt, and you get this a lot from the far right. Well, if a horse was born, somewhere else, blah, 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 would we call the horse a donkey? All that nonsense. I'm sure you've heard all this before, and people say this. So, somebody would say to you, well, if I am, an Englishman born to English parents and I went to Israel and my son was born in Israel, does this make my son Israeli, for example, as an ethnically Israeli? What would your answer be? So that's
Yeah, and now I always think, even within extremist views, it is worth often trying to hear what's the point of truth, right? There's a deep Jewish teaching that within every falsehood in the world, there's usually a kernel of truth. And when you can access it, you can see what they're pushing against. I think Britain post World War II, like a lot of European countries, became a bit ashamed of its extravagant supremacy, right? They kind of saw that, look what the supremacy did to the world, it's terrible, and almost went too far to the other extreme of extreme multiculturalism.
yes,
I remember growing up, and my mother once said it to me, and it was very interesting. Like when we grew up, there was still a very strong sense that you're in a Christian British country, right? It's good to learn, you have to learn English, and if you can learn the Queen's English, that's even better. I have a very little Manchester accent, partly because as a kid, I left Manchester 30 something years ago. I didn't have a very strong accent, but as a kid, we actually had elocution lessons because it was good to learn Queen's English. Now you can see that, of course, it's good to be in a country which also celebrates regional accents, right? But there was a sense you were in a Christian country. The country shut on Sunday. There was Christmas was a thing. Easter was a thing. And as Jews, we were a minority, but we were very happy to be in a country that welcomed us, that gave us the same vote as everybody else, that if someone attacked us criminally, we could go to the same courts and get justice. But we understood that if we want to keep a different culture and religion, we're the guests. Now, I get that the country wanted to a little bit overcompensate, say, no, don't be guests. You're the same as all of us. You're citizens like all of us. And of course, as an individual level, we were citizens like everybody else. But we had the sense that there's a dominant culture. It's a very tolerant culture. It doesn't stop us going to synagogues. It doesn't try to stop us. Maybe at one point it was too extreme. If you don't turn up and work on the Sabbath, you get fired. And it's very good that Britain will say, no, you can't do that. But it could go too far where it's like, oh, no, we're not a Christian country, the British European heritage. We're an everything country. Because in welcoming in all the guests, you sever your own identity. And a young British person growing up becomes ashamed of it. Identity becomes supremacy. You're a white supremacist, a Christian supremacist. And I think a large part of the country is waking up and going, one sec, you try to turn us into this global European pan citizen of planet Earth. Fine, but I want my identity. My ancestors have lived in this, in Devon for 900 years. My great-grandparents lived in Manx when it was a Roman. Manchester was a fort, and mine lived in, and we've been part of this country and all it's good and all it's bad, but overall it's tremendous good for the world. And now we're supposed to be ashamed. We're not celebrating our heritage. We don't have our cultural identity. Yeah. We can't do something that marks us out as different. And I think there's a big backlash now, right?
Yes.
Immigrants have kind of trampled the country. And okay, it can become exaggerated and so on. But there is a kernel of truth to Britain went too far to accommodate all of us minorities to the point of potentially denigrating. And I think elites in cosmopolitan cities didn't always feel the pain that was causing to the massive
Yes.
cities. And then globalization comes and it makes the cities very wealthy at the expense of jobs on the periphery. And people are turning around. And now the internet comes and people in social media, people can get together and say, oh, you also hold that view? Oh, you also hold that view? And suddenly there's this big backlash. And I think there's a legitimacy to the backlash. Now, when it goes to the extreme of you must all be identical, then we go too far the other way, right? So there's the question of
Yes.
where's the dynamic medium?
Yeah, it's a serious challenge because you now get a lot of, people saying things like, if Israel and the UK went to war, who would you support as a Jew? And you get a lot of these questions. Obviously, it's a hypothetical question and it's actually meaningless because it's highly unlikely that the UK and Israel will ever go to war unless, potentially jihadists take over the UK, which means, and try to attack Israel, then that's, there is a likelihood this could happen. But, again, that's highly unlikely. So I think for me, the question of identity is actually really interesting. And it's also something that, a lot of people struggle with because I struggle with it. I think also what I noticed and saw is, we once had a group of Jews within the Voice of the People, the President's Initiative, and we asked one simple question: what is home? To every Jew who was in the room. And I think everyone gave a very complex answer. So that's part of Jewish identity. You will never see anyone just saying, look, home is, the US or the UK, and that's it. There is always but. I've also lived there, or I've also, lived in Israel for a bit. So do you think this also creates an issue that Jewish identity is quite complex and multi-layered? So if I ask you, for example, what is home? You live in Israel now. You grew up
Yeah.
in the UK. What is home for you?
For me, home right now is definitely Israel, but I have a very strong and deep feeling for Britain too. But I would say like this: my grandfather, in fact, all my grandparents came to England and managed to escape what would have become their termination in Europe. My wife's side, again, everyone obviously got there, but lots of them lost lots of family there. My side, they didn't. But my grandfather saw a lifelong loyalty to Britain. He served in the British Army in World War II, right? He always was very proud of his British citizenship. And then when the state of Israel was under attack, he went and volunteered to defend them too. He didn't see that as a contradiction. We grew up with a very deep sense of loyalty to Britain. I saw myself as a full British citizen, right? And just like British citizens can go and live in Spain and go and live in Cyprus and can go and live anywhere, that's a global world, right? But at the end of the day, certainly if you're living in Britain and being protected by Britain and benefiting from its services and everything, I think you have to feel a very strong responsibility. I felt as a Jew an even stronger responsibility, partly because I wasn't part of the native culture. And, I large parts of the native culture I did absorb, but I actually felt that I have a huge responsibility as a British citizen. And like my grandfather, if Britain would be under attack, I would volunteer and go and defend it. This whole hypothetical of what part of the reason why it's so unthinkable is because part of the affinity between why someone from Britain can just go and move to France or Spain, but it'd be a lot harder for them to move to Russia or
Yes.
Iran is because the culture's so intertwined, right? Because
Yes.
because we're part of a Western world. So somebody moving to France is not radical. Someone retiring on the south of Spain or Cyprus is not radical because you're operating within the same broad global world perspective and culture. So Israel and Britain's in the same zones of perspective, I think, as well. If they would ever diverge to the point of becoming enemies, then that would be a very deep identity conflict. And I think
Yes.
that's like, somebody comes out of Iran and lives in Israel, they've got that real conflict. But I don't think that's a conflict for a British Jewish citizen today because the cultures are so aligned. But I always felt there's a huge responsibility to, be a better citizen, right? To make sure
Yes.
that we as a community are contributing tremendously to society and being very harsh on ourselves when there's shortcomings, when people are caught doing criminal activity or they're doing something wrong. We should, especially if we're going to take the privilege of dressing in a way that's visibly Jewish, like a kippah on the head. Now, you pointed out people coming to, let's say, certain conferences will feel that identity conflict. There is, of course, a lot of people born Jewishly who feel no conflict. They're British with maybe a smattering of Jewish heritage. And for them, there's no conflict. The conflict comes from the more committed. Because if people are deeply committed to Jewish religion, or other forms of Jewish identity, then they will feel two identities. They will feel dual identities, but they're not dual loyalties in the sense I don't think the loyalties compete, except in hypothetical
Doesn't this
worlds.
doesn't this mean you're not integrating? because we get a lot of this now, this argument that if you're very religious, if you're Muslim and you're very religious, so you choose not to eat pork, you choose to not celebrate Christmas because that's against your religious views. You don't see Jesus, in the way that, Jesus celebrated, around Christmas. So a lot of people would get, okay, well, that means you're not integrating, you're not accepting our way of life, you're not accepting the way we dress, you're not accepting, especially if you're very religious on the Jewish side, then obviously, your wife also dresses in a different way. Your children, go to, learn and receive their education in a different way. Does this not mean that, essentially what we're discussing is that the more left leaning a Jew is, the more integrated they are in their society, for example. Like if you have someone who says, I don't care about Israel, for instance, they live in America, they're an American Jew on the left, and they say, I don't care about Israel, I don't care what happens to Israel. We actually had this conversation with David Badil. I had quite a heated exchange with him once because he said, yes, I'm Jewish, but I feel absolutely nothing towards Israel. And for me, this was very weird. He said, when I go there, I like it. It's like visiting Greece. It's like visiting Spain. It's nice. It's sunny, blah, blah, blah. But I don't really care about Israel. I don't feel like when I land in Ben Gurion that this is home, or this is, somewhere where I have a deep connection. It's just a holiday destination.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you say that, the more religious a Jew is, the less integrated they are, or the more sort of a conflict of identity they have?
So I think it's a great question. And I always wrestled with it as a minority. But it's interesting being in Israel because the same question flips the other way, right? Israel has lots of minority communities. Take the Druze as a very good example. They're a clear minority, but they're very strong with their identity. They don't want to be Jewish. They want to keep their customs. In their villages, they even fly a different flag. They also fly the State of Israel flag, but they fly a Druze flag, and they're fiercely loyal to Druze all over. Right? Israel, as was known, was on verge of some kind of negotiated peace with Syria. What exactly it would have been, I don't know, people didn't know whether they could trust Jelani or not, but then the attack came against the Druze, and the Israeli Druze went crazy, went on the streets, protested, and the view of the Israeli citizens, the Jewish population, was not, oh, these are disloyal. They're looking at, and then Israel literally intervened to protect the Druze, and it might have hurt their position globally. I don't think most Israelis looked at that and said, how dare they have Jew loyalty? How dare they mess up what's good for us? And there they were literally pushing for a foreign intervention, a war for the Druze, right?
Yes.
So the Israelis didn't turn around and go, oh, this man. But why? Because they've earned it. Because they serve in the IDF and they've earned it in a covenant of blood. In other words, they are loyal citizens. They're fiercely loyal citizens. They have another identity, right?
Yeah.
It's a Jewish state. They respect that, but they have a different identity that also gives them a sense of brotherhood with other people in other parts of the world that can be awkward for Israel sometimes to navigate. And Israel went out and defended their brothers, the Druze brothers. It was morally right thing to protect them too, given the slaughter they were under. But in the geopolitical calculation, it's their citizens. They've earned the right to have a say in our foreign policy. But you see, there they treat themselves as a minority. They have a dignity about who they are. Nobody asks them to assimilate and be like all the Jewish population. Nobody's upset if they dress differently, but they also respect their position as a minority. They don't impose on everybody else to be like the majority. And I think that's a good example of how this can work. I'll give you an example personally. When I go out, let's say out of the areas that have, let's say we lived in areas that are very predominantly Jewish, but if we were going on an outing, I would wear a cap, not because I think I'd fool somebody into thinking I'm not Jewish. I'm not hiding my Jewishness. I felt personally that this can, maybe some people feel poked that, Jewish religion, anything on your head's good enough. So I didn't just want to be poking an eye at people. Do you know, this is like on Shabbat, we wear a talit. I personally always put it under a jacket, not because I'm hiding my Jewish. Everyone can see I'm Jewish. I'm wearing a hat on the Shabbat. I think there's a sensitivity to being a minority and to wanting to show a deference and a respect to the dominant society. You can be proud of your own, but I think the vibe should be, yes, we're doing something a little bit separate, but we're doing that so that we can ultimately contribute as a community to the greater good. I think that's what the Jews do very clearly in Israel, and almost everybody respects them for it. And that earns their place at the table, even when they have an agenda to say, look, I know it may not be good for the rest of you, but this is something we're really passionate about. can you do this for us? And the state turns around and goes, 100%. You're a part of our community. You're part of our family. You're citizens like the rest of us. You've earned your say. And if this is important to you, it's important to us. And I think if all minorities, if British people, let's say from the majority, felt that's how minorities are, that we're proud to be part of Britain, we're proud you've let us in. We're not going to ask you to change your flag. We're not going to ask that the king of the country is also the head, not of the Church of England, but all, we accept Church of England is a Church of England state, right? We accept the holidays, the Christian holidays are going to be the main things on the calendar. We love the fact you're tolerant of us, and we see that as something we then have to earn. And we have a responsibility being a minority that keeps different culture and different customs to you. And that very freedom and that two-way dynamic, I think, is important. The minute people perceive that minorities are taking advantage or demanding to change the dominant identity, that's when I think you get a lot of backlash, a lot of kickback. And I suspect it's no one individual's fault. I think governments, in their attempt to be so kind to minorities, and media, in an attempt to try to push against the old supremacy, probably went too far. And finding that balance is now as a responsibility we've all got to find, and it's true all over the world, but especially all over tolerant, liberal Western societies.
Yes, but I think it's actually very challenging because it's I suppose this is a bit of a philosophical question, because if you look at this, you're going to realize, at least that's how I feel, that in history, once a country goes down this this route or this path, it becomes very difficult to change course. So once you're as divided as Britain is today, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually change course, because you now have huge numbers of different minorities. They each see themselves in society in a different way. The state over the past at least 20 years hasn't actually made any demands. The state hasn't made any demands from minorities. That this is what you must do. You must compromise. You must integrate. There was almost nothing. And we also see a lot of things, for example, in when you take actually the test for British citizenship, you see that now there is a question about religion. There is a question that, asks you about Muslim holidays or Muslim religious festivals, and people find that really quite bizarre. I find it bizarre, to be honest. Why should anyone be asked about, Muslim holidays or even Jewish holidays or anything else? Yes, you must be asked about Christianity because this is a Christian country. Its history, its identity, even the flag of Britain. It's got the cross on it. It's for a very good reason. So I suppose that's a question to you also, as someone who studied the history of Am Yisrael, the Jewish nation generally. Do you think we're at a point now where there is almost no return for Britain when it comes to division and this infighting?
Well, I think there's different processes. All over the Western world, there's a very deep tribalism. And what was once local issues within countries kind of crosses boundaries. And you got the global right and the global left and this tribe and that tribe. And of course, as a Jewish people, there's always a weird lens that goes on to Jews, that people literally define political parties by their position on Israel. I mean, that's another crazy thing. So all these things are always, I don't know. I think predicting the future based on a trajectory is very difficult, especially given that the world, the technologies are speeding up for the good and for the bad. The world's going down so many different pathways. A lot of social attitudes today, 10 years ago, would not have been on the cards. I remember, how long ago was it that we had the Me Too movement? It feels like lifetimes ago. And then you had the Black Lives Matter movement, and then LGBTQ, and I got this big conservative push and new rise of Catholicism and a whole explosion of anti-Semitism intertwined with anti-Israelism. It's like all this stuff, revolutions are happening now every 2
But that's unprecedented in human history, isn't it? Like, because I'm not mistaken to say it's actually entirely unprecedented how fast we're moving. I mean, if you look at the 90s, I remember in the 90s in Egypt when I was young, we had these very old Nokia phones, and that was basically, that was fascinating. Now you've got a tiny small phone that can do things that no one even imagined 10 years ago.
There's no question we cannot begin to dream of imagining what the world will be like in 30 years' time.
Yes.
Probably the gap between us and 30 years is probably bigger than well over 1,000 years, 2003. Like, you have to go thousands of years in the past to have a gap as big as. So the speed at which that information, ideas, attitudes moves shapes the speed at which social revolutions can take place. They can literally, just like companies can now go from naught to, whatever it is, top 100 in very short periods of time, ideological movements can come along. Now, people assumed it will create a world where people see each other's perspectives far more, and it's actually, if anything, tribalized a lot more. But that's why it's unpredictable. If the world is going to stay like it is now, we might be able to guess where things will move towards in 10, 20, 30 years' time, but it's not going to. So there's no real way to extrapolate these trajectories. So I don't think we have to be doom and gloom about it. I think we have to be very clear-eyed about the problems. But put it this way, as somebody Jewish, I always think about history, because every time we look in a prayer book, we're looking at layers of thousands of years. Every time we open a Jewish legal work, you're looking at thousands of years. We still are in one of the best times in Jewish and human history. Look at being a citizen in Britain today.
Yes.
How many times in history could you put this on your head, keep the Sabbath, eat kosher, and walk down the street and expect to be able to go to the same university as everyone else, be in this? I mean, Jews were in ghettos for half of history or thrown out of country.
So just sorry to interrupt again, because I really like having, sort of, again, a brief, back and forth. So does that mean that people who say, myself included, that, we're sort of in the 1930s in Britain now, is that a misjudgment, or are we sort of, being a bit, doom and gloom, like you said?
So in terms, specifically the 1930s, maybe.
Yes.
And that's, but I'm talking about in general terms of tolerance and intolerance of British society as a whole, it's remarkable. Now, where the 1930s has some analogy is I think one of the worst things we ever did in Holocaust education. There were several mistakes, in my opinion, but one of them was we didn't talk about the process. We preferred it to be like a bunch of evil monsters came down from another planet, took over Germany, and did these terrible things. The real question was, how did a democracy, the most advanced modern democracy in the world, with a tolerant liberal society, how did it flip in a very short period of time to one where the average person could seriously believe that Jews had been responsible for massacring Germans in World War I and all sorts of other absurdities? And we almost didn't want to play people the speeches and show how the legal departments shifted and the public media figures moved and this moved and that moved, and our masses just were sure, and everyone else can't be wrong, and maybe that kind of process we are seeing very strong echoes of it.
Yes.
On the other hand, there are also differences, right? There's definitely at the fringe. It could move into the mainstream. Israel moving to parts of the mainstream fast. It could move very quickly. That's certainly true. We do have a state of Israel, which means the effort it's going to have to overcome the natural wave that sometimes hits a society of Jew demonization aimed at the collective Jew is today aimed at the collective Jew, which is Israel. Israel represents the collective Jewish people. So that's why
Israel is also another entirely, unprecedented also, in Israel as it is today is definitely unprecedented, but it comes with its own set of questions, with its own set of challenges.
Absolutely.
So for example, when you visit Israel, I remember, meeting this Israeli who was from Russian heritage, and he was very, very doom and gloom, as he said. He was basically telling me Israel is not going to survive because we've got a massive Haredi community, and the Haredi community gets a lot of money, and they're going to be the majority at some point. And if they are the majority, then we basically have no army, we have no functioning economy, and it's going to be really horrific. So I think, again, the question of identity is really challenging, especially when it comes to Israel. I think Israel is actually has got its own set of challenges that are distinct, and I would probably say far more fundamental and far more, these are core values for every group within Israel that I don't think they're willing to compromise on.
I agree with you. I think actually I think two things though, a few things. First of all, I agree with you. First of all, having a state of Israel does mean that we're safer than we were in the 1930s because we've actually got somewhere to run to if we ever have to. On the other hand, it means that the venom doesn't have to be aimed at individual Jews who walk the street. The subconscious venom and the weird pathological need to demonize the Jewish collective gets now aimed fully at Israel, and a brutal urban war is the perfect fertile territory for people suffering this infection of Jew demonization. Say, and then just use lots of exaggerated words. Well, they're saying it, and they're saying it, and they're saying it, and they're saying it, so it must be true, etc. And yes, there definitely will be, I think, a cresting wave trying to whip up enough public mood to actually go and try and destroy Israel. It needs a whole justificatory anger to do that. Okay, leave that aside. Talking internally to the state of Israel, I think bringing together a diaspora of Jews who are at various stages of assimilation and from all parts of the world and throwing them into one country and expecting it just to work like
Yes.
that is obviously not going to be a really challenging task. My own view is the best way to deal with tribalism is to have a common mission. And until now, for Israel, the common mission has been survival. That's actually been a glue that's held the society together. Having an enemy that believes it has to a
It
religion.
didn't, though. It didn't. It actually didn't, because after October 7th, we didn't see like huge waves of the Haredi community joining the army. We saw an increase. Yes, I think some people actually underestimate the increase, because I think the increase exists. The increase is, if you look at the data, there is more Haredi men now joining the army than probably ever before, if I'm not mistaken. But even after October 7th, I think this, survival wasn't really as uniting as many of us, myself included, wished.
That's true. I would say slightly different. I'd say on October 8th and 9th, the level of national unity was unprecedented. Maybe just before the 6-Day War or other crises when it looked like we were all going to be destroyed or something. There was immense national unity. I think it's frayed, no question, but also the average Israeli feels a lot safer than they did on October 7th and 8th, right? So that allows the fraying to reopen. So survival, I agree with you, is not the best mission. And also it's not why we waited 2,000 years to come home. I think the national mission is exactly what God said in the Torah, which is, what's the first thing God says to Abraham? Everyone always quotes, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. Yeah. But there's an end to that verse. And through you will be blessed all families of earth. And that's reiterated to Isaac, through your seed will be blessed all nations of earth, and then reiterated to Jacob, through you will be blessed all families of earth, and through your seed. And it's reiterated always. Imagine if Israel got together and said, you know what, we have all these different opinions, right? We're very divided in right and left and religious and secular and this and that, and the non-Jewish minorities and all this stuff. But imagine we say our national mission is through you will be blessed all families on earth. Over the next 20, 30 years, there's going to be innovations like we've never seen before. We're going to be looking for global religious unity with diversity. That's something Jews have baked into their religion. We're going to be looking for the ethical and godly version of how on earth to use these new technologies that are coming to the world. How about we make our national mission, this little tiny people that seem to have a very unique, disproportionate amount of talents for developing things, for caring about other things in the world, actually make it our national mission, our shared national mission, in whichever way we do it. There's religious in one way, there's secular in another way. That every family on earth is blessed because we exist, whether they appreciate us or not for approval, not for appreciation, not for PR or Hasbara, for our own mission. And the point of the mission is only partly that you've got a mission. It's partly that it gives you a sense of, oh, we might disagree with each other, but we've got a common goal and identity. And that's the same with the Western world. You need a common goal and identity that you can ask people to be a part of and to join with. If you don't have a common goal and identity, a vision of who you're meant to be as a state and what you're going to contribute to the world, it's very hard to ask minorities to become part of it without resenting, just kick them out. If you've got a clear sense of this is what we're here to do, this is who we as a people, what we can offer the planet, and we have to look after ourselves to do it, fine. We have to secure ourselves and look after ourselves, care about ourselves, but we're going to do this then you can start to say to minorities, you want to join Britain, this is what Britain is. We expect to see you be a part of this. And we'll now negotiate with you what this is. It's going to be very British, and it will have flavor that has room for minorities too, for sure. Right? You'll shape it. This is what it will be. So now Israel, even more so. America's got this to some degree. America has a degree to which, certainly till recently, Americans feel they're part of manifest destiny, they're bringing a liberal Western thing to the world. They feel a certain national mission. And so you can bring these it's a nation of immigrants, and they can forge an identity. So that, I think, is...
It's also because America has the Constitution. So I think, the Constitution definitely helps. To be an American, you have to believe in this Constitution, because this is what really defines who an American is. I think so. There is this belief in the significance of the Constitution. I think for Israel, there is no such thing, because some people would find it almost unthinkable to actually recognize the Torah as the basis of the common ground that we have. If you meet a secular Jew who does not at all believe in the Torah and sort of almost treats the Torah with contempt, like, religion is something backwards anyway. So I don't believe in the Torah. I don't believe, that there is a God who, sent a book, a holy book, or whatever it is. So I think this contributes to the challenge. It's the same in the UK. You have people who believe in the Quran, you have people who believe in the Torah, you have the majority now are actually atheists who believe that, organized religion is horrible. So how do you get those people to agree on a fundamental basis for identity? This is who we are.
It's a great question. So America had this problem. The founders didn't have a unified group of people, right?
Yes.
You mentioned the Constitution, but there's an even more important document than the Constitution, possibly, which is the Declaration of Independence. Because the Constitution is kind of what binds people and limits what they can do against each other. That's how you work together. But it's the Rabbi Sachs actually wrote about this in a book called The Home We Build Together, where he talks about the difficulties of multiculturalism and dominant societies and so on. But the Americans built this sense of a common covenant that holds people together, gives them a reason to exist. And then the Constitution can define the parameters. So I agree with you that there are Israeli Jews and some Israeli non-Jews who wouldn't like the centrality of the Torah. And I don't think we would want to impose a halachic state on people right now. That would not be certainly not the right point at this point in history, if not before Messianic era anyway.
Yes.
But I gave you a suggestion as an example of a single mission statement that's written in the Torah that right now could help Israelis lift their eyes and think to the future. See, the Middle East needs, and the world needs, and Israel needs a way of looking ahead.
Yes.
The Palestinian challenge is a real challenge and people don't appreciate it in large, but how do you deal with a population where at least a large segment believes it's their religious mission to destroy a non-Muslim state in the Middle East? That's not all Palestinians, not all Muslims, not all Arabs, but there's enough in a tiny land that makes two states dangerous at the moment. But you need to have some way of looking to the future to even be able to say, well, let's offer you a partnership in this vision too. Here's a vision we've got. This is what we're going to work towards. Do you want to help shape that vision? But certainly internally, when you've got all these different tribes, you need to be able to say, this is something we can all agree on. And maybe the extreme fringes, there'll be people who don't agree.
Yes.
I think almost every Israeli Jew and almost every Jew in the world would agree that's a Jewish mission that they can all buy into. And it will mean slightly different things to different people. For one group, it will mean we've got to run philanthropy in Africa tomorrow. For another group, it will mean we've got to think about where religious identity, what the Torah tells us about how to integrate minorities and majorities together, how we can have that type of Torah-based dialogue with other religions and so on. There'll be very different interpretations of what it means, but I think that it nevertheless will be that sort of thing will be a very uniting, give us an identity that we share. And then we can start to work out lots of other problems along with it. The other thing is technology can start to solve a lot of problems. When you start to...
Yes.
I'll give you a small example. I'm sorry, am I talking too long?
No.
I'm so sorry. I feel like...
No, it's okay.
Let's take a very trivial issue because it'll be a good demonstration. Let's suppose you gather the very left-wing Israelis, the secular atheistic Israelis. You gather the left-wing animal rights groups. You gather the religious kosher-only groups. And you gather all these groups around the table. The religious guys saying, I want a state where there's only kosher food. And the Israelis go, no way, we want whatever we want. And then someone's going, I want a state where they don't kill animals. No, we want what we want, And I said, well, okay, stop thinking about this as a zero-sum game. Because the truth is we all agree on values, we just don't agree on priorities. Almost everyone agrees it would be nice to have Jewish values if everything else wasn't harmed. Almost everyone agrees it would be nice to have animal rights if everything else isn't harmed. Right? And almost everyone agrees you have what you want. Now, what point could we combine all three? How far in the future could we have all our meat lab produced that tastes as good as regular meat, is as affordable and nutritious? Then we're all sorted together. Right?
Yes.
That's just a small example of you could bring different tribes together and instead of fighting over the present, look into the future and ask, how long will it take to be all of us, like all the values? And then you start to feel your partners in building the future rather than enemies in building the future. And I think you could do that with a lot more areas than we think.
Yes. I have to admit, I'm not optimistic for many reasons. I'm not optimistic for Israel when it comes to unity. I'm not optimistic for the UK when it comes to unity, to be honest, because I also believe that this could be sort of, I don't know, a Middle Eastern mindset. But I also believe sometimes you have to fight it out. Sometimes you have to understand that, at certain points, you're not going to be able to find unity. Sometimes you're going to accept that there is nothing that unites us. We are, two communities with completely contrasting views and values and visions, So, for instance, you find a lot of people who completely disagree with the idea that Israel has the right to exist or that Israel has the right to defend itself. I'm not going to try to find, a common ground with these people, I believe these people should be destroyed. That's a very simple view. If you're trying to destroy Israel, then you should be destroyed because it's an act of self-defense. Whether you believe that Israel has the right to defend itself or not, it's entirely, up to you. But Israel will exercise this right. It's only normal and human that they do. I think also when it comes to, within the community, I also believe that at some points, and I was telling, a colleague, I suppose, who is an American lefty Jew, and I said, look, we have to accept that there is nothing between you and me that unites us. We are people who have completely opposing views. They believe that, illegal immigration, even the use of the word illegal is inhumane. We should say something else. We shouldn't stop illegal immigration. We shouldn't, Israel shouldn't fight Hezbollah. Israel shouldn't fight Hamas. And I said, we are completely different people on different sides, and we are opposing, contrasting, almost warring sides. You have your own view, and I am completely against it. And I think this view is harmful and dangerous and should be destroyed. Legally, obviously, and peacefully. I'm not saying, let's resort to violence. So I think in my view, we are leaning towards more, there has to be a point of unrest, not unrest again in an illegal way, but within, the ideologies themselves, within, this fight to find an identity. There has to be a fight. And, I believe the superior ideas have to win, the superior in terms of, service to humanity. What ideas serve humanity better, open borders where everyone can go anywhere, or regulated, humane immigration, for example. So we just have to have this fight, essentially, I think, politically and peacefully. And after we do this, maybe there will be some hope, but not before this point, I think.
You might be right. You might be right. More pessimistic. You might look. There are many ideological progresses in history that have actually gone through war. Look at the American Revolution, the American Civil War. I mean, the American Revolution. I don't know. The American Civil War is a very good example. There definitely have been things. The defeat of Nazism was military.
Yes.
The defeat of communism was an arms race. So there are things that have happened through violence. I take a slightly different view though, because I think the human has a very strong propensity to, once they emotionally feel negative about another group, to see everything they do as evil.
Yes.
So that you get in conflicts, that you get in political things, and that's very, very dangerous. Let's take some of the examples you gave, and I would say it would be worth trying another. Where do we branch? See, a lot of people think, people say, Israel has no right to this. Let's go as extreme as that, right? There's two basic reasons people would say that. One is an Islamic view, a view that the lands are sacred, Waqf lands, they're part of the old Khalifa, the old Caliphate, and therefore it's not allowed to be non-Muslim lands. That's much harder to negotiate with. If you do that, it has to be on a very deep theological level, okay. But there's other groups who would say, no, it's about indigeneity. Now, you and I might actually agree with them that all things being equal, indigenous people of any land, forget who's indigenous are, people sitting still in a land should not be kicked out of their homes. The thing is, as a supporter of Israel, we're likely to believe and say that's not the correct narrative of what actually happened.
Yes.
That's point one. Point two is we will say that the Jewish people are also indigenous to the land. Now, what people feel is this has to be an either or. If Palestinians have a right, meaning Arabs who were living there under the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire collapses, as it's being carved into states, they have a right to have a state around their culture and identity. If you say that, that means the Jews don't. And if you say the Jews had a right under the Ottoman Empire to return en masse, and then when it's being carved up to states, have one that serves their culture and identity, if you say that, that means the Palestinians don't. If you're in the zero sum, you're stuck. I think we both believe both. I think most people believe that both those claims are legitimate. Now, there's another claim, self-defense, right? And now you've got this tiny land, so we actually agree much more on values. I'll give you an example. I was just listening the other day to some podcast. I think it was Candace Owens and, what's her name?
Bassem Youssef or
no. There's this woman like shrieking about it. Anna Kasparian, that's the name.
Yes.
Right. And they were talking about how the way they were phrasing it was like the people who are anti-genocide and pro-genocide.
Yes.
And you think, there's almost not one person who's pro-Israel who supports one Palestinian innocent, or one civilian, even if they're not that innocent, dying. Right? Nobody supports it.
Yes.
So it's not the values we're disagreeing on. It's sometimes facts. It's sometimes a tribal mind weighing which bits of the narrative make the good guy and the bad guy. We often find that we agree on a lot more things than we think we do. And that's the most difficult of all. This is a deep tribal conflict. It's got religious things. If you're politically left wing, you've grown up with Israel as the villain, and if you're politically this way or that way. But actually, when you bore it down to the raw values, we're much more aligned than people think. Now, take it to
Yes.
much less important. Let's take immigration. Yes, everyone will always see the extremists on the other side, like wide open borders. But what are they actually saying? What they're saying is somebody's really poor somewhere, and you could take them in and care for them. Why wouldn't you do that? If you agree with that value, you just say,
Yes.
but isn't that point where it becomes too much? Now, they hear somebody being like, no, we're white, we're this, we're that, let them all suffer and die, and we don't care about them, right? That's
Yes.
extremists who say that, but the average person who's pro-tight immigration rules is not like that, right?
Yes.
The average person who's pro-open borders agrees there's a point at which if 400 million people walked in, so we agree on a lot more, but we've prepped ourselves to believe the other side's evil, to see its worst caricatures, and then we get more dug in, and then they get more dug in, and then we don't trust each other. We can't solve problems together. Whereas if you have a sense that I'm willing to see the good in you, right? And I'm willing to see where I don't agree with you. And sometimes there will have to be a fight. And sometimes if you're going to bring a force, if Hezbollah believes they have to kill and die, fine, we're going to have to fight them back. We're not going to, our compromise is not that we die
Yes.
for them, right? So, but in most cases, I think we could develop on a societal level a deeper maturity of learning to see where we're really conflicting. What's the world look like through your eyes? Because, right? And I think we're in a position in the world where we could do that more and more.
Yeah, it's I think it is challenging. I think, I'd like us to have, a few more conversations focusing on specific cases. For instance, the future of Judaism, because I think, the future of Judaism, well, the future of the Jewish people generally is something that I think is very interesting. Again, we are in unprecedented times, even the words, tikkun olam, what is tikkun olam? And you're going to find that now the left defines tikkun olam in a completely different way from what it actually meant, or at least, that's what many people believe. So I think, we can have many conversations. I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to keep on going much longer. But I think I want to conclude with two very sort of brief questions. What is a moment that you're very proud of since October 7th for Israel, and the moment that you feel we should be ashamed of?
Wow, those are powerful questions. I think there's lots of moments to be proud of. I mean, some of them are bigger than a specific moment, like with everything in Gaza, the fact that 2,200,000 Gazans have been kept alive in a brutal urban war zone where there were tunnels in every single building, and it is a miracle, and one that a lot of people worked extremely hard. I'll tell you one very tiny moment that I'm very proud of, but there's many, many more. So there's a guy called Rudy Rockman. He's a popular influencer, and he's a peacemaker, but he's also a soldier. And he was in there, and he described one moment where they walked into the house, and they'd been fighting in the house and RPGs, and the place was a complete mess. And he sees a Quran on the floor, and he picked it up, and it's a sacred book to them, and he put it as neatly as he could on the table. It's a tiny, tiny moment. It doesn't compare to the vaccination program of 1 million Gazan children. It doesn't compare to the efforts made to get food to them, the efforts made to move civilians out, the life risking that Israel sent soldiers into tunnels rather than just pulverize the whole place from there. So that's a micro moment of hundreds of thousands of such moments where somebody said, I may be fighting, and this may be a book they've inspired them to come and kill us, but it's sacred to them, and I've got to respect them, and I've got to respect the humanity. That's just one little moment. Moment ashamed of. I was in the old city on Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day.
Yes.
And I have to say, I often walk through the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and I have to say that, I'm going to say that 99% of people behaved beautifully. They came in, they were respectful of the locals, they were singing the celebration of the unification of the city. But I saw groups behaving really not nice, like, saying not nice things to local Arabs. So I walked over to a group of kids. I could see they looked like they could be troublemakers and not to be too judgmental. And they were banging on the doors of a house. And I was very ashamed. Similar to what we saw the other day, that video of people, of this guy who ran up to a nun and threw it over. That's
Yes.
probably the most, maybe that's the most ashamed. I don't know. But here it was live face to face. So I confronted
Yes.
them and I said to them, what are you doing? This is human beings. And the guy said to me, they're not human, they're Arab. This kid said this. And I said to them, more than human. They're more than human. They keep the Noahide law. And it was like
Yes.
this shock. This kid, and he sees I'm a religious, he did, and he starts trying to have, and I showed him religious sources, and it was this funny moment. Like they're like, "Oh my goodness, he's right." I was
Yes.
but I was ashamed that they could say something like that. I was ashamed
Yes.
that somebody with a kippah on their head, and I get there's been war, and I'm sure lots of them have relatives who've been killed. I get it, but I don't want in our name to ever become that. And
Yes.
we've seen moments of like that. Of course, there's a ton of exaggeration online and things that aren't true, or a ton of things that are true that are exaggerated. But that was
Yeah.
probably the deepest shame. But at the same time, I was actually proud that I could go over to them, have that conversation, and you could see it was bothering them. And they stopped. At least while I was around, they changed their behavior, and they changed
Yes.
it. I showed them the Torah disagrees with them. And it was like this, like you can imagine they came to be angry hooligans and they're like confronted by the fact that that's anti-Jewish behavior. It's anti-human behavior, it's anti-Jewish. So yeah, so those are, I guess, two moments that stand out amongst endless moments.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your time. I think, we should definitely organize another conversation, maybe next week.
Happy to.
I definitely enjoyed this.
I'd like to hear more of your opinions, Alan. I love when you share. I know you're doing more the interviewing, but it'd be so nice
No,
to
no,
get.
we'll definitely get to that. We'll definitely get to more of this because I think we're going to discuss things that I think I don't really see many people discussing, things that I think should be definitely discussed. The future of Judaism is something that really concerns me for many, many reasons. We've shared these views before, you and me, privately. How some people define certain practices as a very core part of their Jewishness, although actually, in my view, it doesn't really have a strong basis, even in halakha, and I think that's something that I find very interesting.
Okay,
So yeah, so definitely we'll have more conversations. And again, I'm grateful for your time. So thank you, and
thank
until
you.
next time.